Okay, let's unpack this. We've got um, quite a stack of material here, articles, research, notes, all focused on Mexico.
Right.
Not just the country today, but its entire vast, complex, and layered history.
That's right. It's a place where the echoes of ancient civilizations, the shockwaves of, dramatic conquests, the fire of revolutions,
And the modern challenges.
and the persistent challenges of the modern world, yeah, they all collide. It's a
Okay.
history you can't really get your head around by looking at just one piece.
Exactly. And our mission in this deep dive is to, well, go through this material and pull out the most important nuggets, the key insights, maybe some surprising facts too.
Sort of a shortcut.
Think of it as a shortcut, yeah, to being well-informed about a place that's been shaped by millennia of, well, dramatic events.
We'll be moving through time from the very earliest inhabitants and the rise and fall of these incredible empires
Right.
through the profound transformation of colonialism, the long and often bloody fight for independence, the turbulence of the 19th
The
century,
revolution.
the defining impact of the Mexican Revolution, and right into the complexities of contemporary Mexico.
And the goal isn't just like a timeline. It's about seeing how this deep past is fundamentally wired into the Mexico of today. Why does what happened centuries, even millennia ago, still matter so much now? Let's dive in.
Okay, so where do the sources tell us this story really begins? With humans arriving in what is now Mexico, many thousands of years ago, maybe around 15,000 BC.
Wow.
Initially, they were, nomadic
You're
hunters.
following big game like mammoths, I suppose, until those started disappearing.
Exactly.
And that disappearance around 10,000 BC, that was actually a huge turning point, wasn't it? Our sources point out that by 8,000 BC, particularly in central Mexico, groups started shifting dramatically.
Absolutely. They began cultivating plants, maize, beans, squash, in what was basically an agricultural revolution for the region.
Right.
This led to more reliable food, fueling population growth, the rise of settled villages, and the beginnings of ceremonial centers.
And this agricultural base allowed for something incredible to emerge. We start seeing sophisticated civilizations develop.
Yeah.
These weren't just farms. They were societies with like trade networks, monumental architecture, early writing systems.
Astronomy even. Advanced astronomy.
Really?
Yeah. The sources highlight the Olmec as perhaps the earliest significant culture, emerging around 1500 BC in the Gulf lowlands. They really laid some foundational stones for Mesoamerican civilization.
Okay, the Olmec.
Yeah.
They built these complex ceremonial centers, like as early as 1200 BC sites like San Lorenzo and La Venta.
Huh.
And they're most famous for those enormous carved stone heads. What did the sources say about those? They're incredible, right?
They're incredible, massive, some weighing as much as 25 tons, like a small house,
Wow.
and quarried hundreds of miles away. Just the logistics of moving them speaks volumes about their social organization and control.
Yeah, you need that.
The Olmec controlled wealth from trade and agriculture, building pyramids, and, interestingly, sophisticated drainage systems, too.
It's fascinating that despite their huge influence on cities, buildings, even that ball game,
The Mesoamerican ballgame, yeah.
they didn't leave a formal writing system that we understand today. Our knowledge comes from symbols, archaeology.
Right, from iconography.
Yet their key centers were abandoned by 400 BC, just gone.
Well, the centers were abandoned, yes. They disappeared as a dominant force, but their influence didn't. They are truly considered a mother culture because elements of their social organization, religious ideas, even agriculture echoed for centuries afterward.
Okay, so their legacy lived on.
Very much so.
Then, starting in the first millennium BC, we see the rise of the Maya civilization developing across the Yucatan Peninsula and surrounding areas.
The Mayas were brilliant. I mean, they built those iconic temple pyramids in really challenging rainforest environments.
Right in the jungle.
And developed arguably the most advanced writing system in the ancient Americas. Their cities like Tikal, Palenque, they were major urban hubs by the early centuries AD, linked by extensive trade.
But our sources describe a significant decline for many of these classic Maya cities around 800, 900 AD. Was there like one single reason? Or
the sources suggest it was complex, probably a combination of factors. Intense warfare between competing city-states, environmental pressures, possibly linked to population growth and climate shifts leading to food shortages.
Makes sense.
And maybe internal social unrest, too. Many major cities were just abandoned.
Though it's important to remember, the Maya people and some centers persisted.
Yeah.
Coastal areas, you said, continued to thrive.
Yeah, and places like Chichen Itza became important later on, though it too faced collapse eventually. Around 1200 AD, ecological issues, invasions.
But wasn't a total vanishing act.
Not at all. Post-classic Maya states were still active when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, and the deep Maya worldview that focused on balancing human, natural, supernatural worlds, that's a powerful part of their enduring legacy.
Okay. Meanwhile, back in the central Mexico highlands, there's this continuous threat of occupation. Village societies grew, leading to early urban centers until a volcano.
Yeah, the Zitli volcano eruption around 100 BC, it disrupted the area significantly.
Wow.
And that disruption seems to have paved the way for the rise of Teotihuacan in the basin of Mexico. The Teotihuacanos built a truly monumental city.
Monumental is the word. Huge pyramids, a grand central avenue, massive apartment compounds, sophisticated urban planning.
Teotihuacan was an economic engine, known for its crafts and extensive trade, especially based on obsidian.
But
its decline, kind of mysterious, in the 7th century AD created a significant power vacuum in the region.
A vacuum waiting to be filled.
Exactly. And it was into this space that the groups we would later call the Aztecs, who called themselves the Mexica, or Tenochca. They eventually rose to prominence, building their incredible capital, Tenochtitlan, right where Mexico City is today.
It's interesting the sources point out that the very name Mexico comes from these indigenous names, Mexica and Tenochca.
Yeah, from Nahuatl.
But after the Spanish conquest, the Spanish authorities actually discouraged or even forbade the use of these native terms. They preferred generic labels like Indios or, well, worse, derogatory term.
Which is a powerful early sign, isn't it? A sign of the profound changes the Spanish arrival would bring.
Absolutely. The first Spanish contact was actually with the Maya in the Yucatan around 1517. But the event that dominates the history books is Hernan Cortez's expedition, starting around 1520 with a surprisingly small group of Spaniards.
Yeah, like 25 initially. And it's fascinating the sources note Cortez was a nobleman but didn't have prior military command experience before this.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yet he proved incredibly strategic. He spent almost 2 years marching inland, not just fighting the Mexica directly at first, but leveraging existing tensions.
The rivalries.
And defeating rival tribute states who resented Mexica rule. Very shrewd.
And initially, the Mexica king, Montezuma II, received the Spanish as guests in Tenochtitlan.
Right.
The sources mention this belief that the Spaniards might fulfill prophecies about the god Quetzalcoatl returning.
Yeah, the feathered serpent god.
Which certainly must have complicated Montezuma's reaction.
You'd think so. But that guest status didn't last, did it?
No. The Spanish eventually killed the king and occupied the capital. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was the decisive moment.
And it's staggering to think about the size of Tenochtitlan. Not just the largest city in the Americas,
but huge globally, right?
Yeah, comparable in size to the largest cities in Europe at the time. Maybe 200,000 people or even more. Just incredible.
Sources describe how, even in the ruins after the city fell, thousands of native people gathered in the ceremonial plaza to mourn their king and openly condemn the Spanish actions. This wasn't a quiet ending.
No, definitely not. And from the Spanish side, contemporary accounts framed Cortez almost like a new heroic figure, an Odysseus.
Constructing the narrative.
Exactly, highlighting the narrative they wanted to tell.
But the reality of the conquest's impact was far more brutal and widespread. Within just a few decades, Spanish armies conquered most of the native peoples in their territories.
It wasn't immediate or easy everywhere. Parts of the Maya lowlands held out for much longer. Decades of warfare there in the later 16th century. Okay.
But the overall pattern was, rapid dominance.
Within about a century, colonial rule was firmly in place over vast territories.
And our sources really emphasize that this wasn't just a change of leadership. It was a total transformation. Political, economic, social, cultural, religious structures all changed on an unprecedented scale.
The sheer scale of the Mexican Empire is evident just from the population. Estimates for the basin of Mexico made 1.5 million people.
Yeah, and Tenochtitlan itself may be 500,000 or more in its provinces. The sources highlight the complexity and wealth-stratified society, market economy, sophisticated public works.
And the Spanish were, well, smart about exploiting the political divisions among indigenous groups, using alliances.
But the human cost was immense. Sources estimate that over 1.5 million people from the basin and surrounding areas were killed or displaced. Whole cities turned to rubble.
Just devastating. which brings us to the 3 centuries of colonial rule. And our sources underscore you can't understand this era without remembering that deep pre-Hispanic past. Absolutely. The Spanish largely viewed indigenous people as, well, inferior, unfit for education, meant to be on the margins.
Right.
And while there's talk of mestizaje, this mixing of cultures and peoples,
Which is often emphasized.
it is, but
Yeah.
our sources are clear that colonial structures of power and, crucially, indigenous resistance were constants throughout this period. It wasn't just passive mixing.
Education itself became a colonial tool, didn't it?
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
It wasn't about empowering indigenous knowledge. It was about civilizing, Catholicizing, imposing Spanish language, and replacing pre-Hispanic worldviews.
So assimilation, basically.
Pretty much. Indigenous people were classified into lower castes, their knowledge disregarded. Schooling aimed to create a single, homogenized identity based on colonial narratives.
And New Spain's geography itself is enormous, incredibly diverse. Deserts, rainforests, mountains, plains.
Yeah, vast. And this diversity mirrored the cultural tapestry from pre-Hispanic times, the Olmec, Maya, Mexica legacies in engineering, art, science.
And this met the Hispanic heritage Catholicism, Spanish architecture, the Spanish language, which is now spoken by the vast majority.
Though hundreds of thousands still speak indigenous languages, it's important to note.
Right. So this deep cultural blending, this syncretism, it's profoundly visible in Mexico today.
Oh, yeah. The vibrant festivals, the world-famous food, the intricate handicrafts, it's a constant negotiation between those two worlds.
The colonial structure itself was rigid, replicating Spain's. Towns with plazas, churches,
The grid batter.
and a strict social hierarchy based on birth and race. Spanish-born Gashupines at the top, then Creoles born in the Americas, then mestizos, then indigenous peoples at the bottom.
Political and economic power totally concentrated. Spanish law, education,
Yeah.
imposed.
Yet the ancient culture wasn't simply erased, it had to be accommodated somehow.
Right, leading to what the sources call creolization, where European ways were adapted to the New World context. Catholicism became dominant. Many indigenous leaders converted.
But maybe not completely.
Well, ancient beliefs often persisted beneath the surface or blended in new ways. Syncretism again.
And in a surprising detail, our sources note that some Spanish priests and nuns actually learned indigenous languages, wrote dictionaries.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And monasteries sometimes incorporated indigenous knowledge like calendars alongside Christian symbols. It wasn't a simple one-way street, even under dominance.
No, it's complex. But the Catholic Church was hugely influential, shaping worldview and daily life. It's still the largest religion today.
Though, as the sources note, over the last few decades, secularization has increased, and other religions, particularly evangelical denominations, have grown significantly.
Especially in indigenous communities in the Southeast. Yeah, changing that religious landscape quite a bit.
And evangelization itself was a systematic effort, right alongside the military conquest led by missionary orders from the 1520s.
Mexico was called the longest mission field in church history. Religious unity was seen as crucial for New Spain's political and economic control.
So the big takeaway from this colonial era, according to the sources, is that this blend, and also the imposition of structures, created layers of identity and social dynamics that are still absolutely key to understanding modern Mexico.
Yeah, this history isn't just background, it's foundational to the present. You have to understand it.
Which leads us, naturally, to the dramatic struggle for independence. Our sources describe the period right after 1821 as incredibly unstable. Economic, political crises.
Yeah, it sounds like the independence itself didn't immediately resolve the underlying tensions at all.
No. Even independence holidays became excuses for old conflicts landowners and mestizos versus the Spanish-born elite.
And there was rising crime, uprisings, a breakdown of order where the army itself got involved in banditry. Sounds chaotic.
Very. Many figures were central to this fight. Radical priests like Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla were influential.
Hidalgo is iconic, isn't he? A priest acutely aware of social injustices, who launched the rebellion on September 16, 1810, with that famous Grito de Dolores.
The cry of independence. And that cry ignited a massive movement. Tens of thousands joined him quickly. They marched, took cities.
But his treatment of Spanish populations, sometimes brutal, damaged his cause, according to the sources. He was captured and executed pretty early on, 1811.
Right, so others had to carry on, like José María Morelos y Pavón.
Yeah, another priest, and Ignacio Allende.
Interestingly, our sources highlight Agustín de Iturbide, a former Spanish general, as the one who ultimately engineered the independence.
More conservative.
More conservative and clerical than the initial revolutionaries, yeah.
But the core revolutionary struggle was carried forward by figures like Vicente Guerrero. Initially devoted to the radical vision, the sources note he developed a kind of pragmatic realism,
How so?
recognizing that a shift in strategy was needed to finally defeat the Spanish. More adaptable.
And that pragmatic shift led to a crucial turning point the sources describe: secret negotiations between Guerrero and Iturbide in 1821.
Ah, they joined forces.
Yeah, which ultimately steered the independence movement in a more conservative direction than Hidalgo's initial, more radical aims.
Interesting dynamic. Looking at the major events, conspiracies against Spanish rule were bubbling up as other colonies revolted,
Hidalgo's credo was the spark,
which led to a decade of civil war. And then, after independence was achieved, Iturbide proclaimed an empire in 1821.
which the sources call a kind of coup.
Yeah, and it ultimately led to his exile and more civil wars, not stable at all.
The subsequent Republican period saw limited reforms. Problems of inequality, corruption, and critically territorial loss continued.
Santa Anna keeps popping up. His return and laws in the 1830s were controversial.
And the targeting of core ideas like freedom and equality in the 1850s even led to a violent period known as La Semana Tragica.
Then came the French intervention under Napoleon III, trying to install a monarchy with Maximilian.
Right, the brief monarchy.
But a Mexican guerrilla army eventually forced the French out in 1867. That must have backfired for Napoleon III.
Yeah. The end of foreign intervention brought hope, but it was quickly followed by Porfirio Diaz's coup in 1876.
Ah, Diaz. He ruled for 3 decades, bringing stability, regaining territory, connecting Mexico with railways, particularly to the U.S. market.
So some modernization.
Definitely. But this stability came at a high cost: authoritarian rule, where the benefits flowed mainly to a small elite and foreign investors.
While the poor population was neglected.
Exactly. And this fueled the indignation that would eventually lead to the next major upheaval, the revolution.
The impact of the independence movement itself was profound, starting with that rapid mobilization under Hidalgo. Tens of thousands.
They had early successes, seizing towns, but the sources point to issues with the discipline of this quickly assembled army and the destruction it sometimes caused.
Which led to calls for amnesty, right?
Yeah.
Concerns about the chaos.
Yeah. And Spain reinforced its efforts. The war was incredibly costly. Sources say around 890 million pesos, damaging the army significantly by 1818.
So it was a long, hard slog.
Definitely. The struggle had broad support across different social groups, but it also faced internal challenges and required constant rethinking of strategy.
Which brings us squarely into the 19th century following independence, a period the sources paint as incredibly challenging. Political status changed, but the underlying social structure, not so much.
And the 2 defining struggles of the century were recurrent economic and political crises and territorial disintegration.
Territorial disintegration. This is where the U.S. looms large, isn't it?
Yeah. The U.S. acquired vast portions of Mexico's northern territories between the 1820s and 1840s through conflict, war, diplomacy.
Leaving a lasting legacy of resentment and fear of U.S. intentions. Understandable.
Ironically, this territorial loss spurred efforts within Mexico to create more effective governance, shifting power towards states and municipalities.
The 1824 Constitution established a federal system.
But the sources suggest many local areas were basically ungovernable, and this federal structure, while intended to distribute power, arguably fueled factionalism and instability in this period. Didn't quite work as planned.
And economic problems hit early in the 1820s, leading to a severe crisis by the late 1820s. Production plummeted, silver, agriculture.
Government revenue dried up, and the lack of a strong tax system made it hard to collect anything or recover.
This crisis contributed to increased executive power, and the sources describe actions that seem to roll back some independence ideals, like repealing communal property laws.
And redistributing land to elites and even convicts, causing public discontent. Yeah, that wouldn't go over well.
Political instability was just endemic. The period from 1824 to the mid-1850s is characterized as institutionalized disorder.
That's a strong phrase.
It is. Sources note that in over 40 years, there were only about 15 without presidential upheaval, constant pronunciamientos, basically coups or uprisings ousting the executive.
A political nolo contendere, one source called it. Like nobody could really win or establish control.
Mexico was repeatedly invaded, blockaded, torn apart by civil war between the 1830s and 1860s.
That description of Mexico as more a geographical expression than a political one really captures it, doesn't it?
It does. The sources tried to explain this turmoil. Some say the Constitution was too early, others blame the federal system, or maybe just the deep divisions from the colonial era never got resolved.
Could be all of the above.
Foreign intervention was a constant threat, too. The sources mention a particularly nasty war around 1842-1844 involving various powers with commercial and territorial aims.
And internal political motives trying to overthrow Santa Anna.
Yeah, the fragmented details about ships and seizures just highlight how disruptive and confusing these external pressures were.
Then you have the Reform Wars, fueled by intense discontent over the liberal reform laws starting in the mid-1850s.
People literally took up arms to defend traditional privileges, the fueros, held by the church and military.
Protests escalated, gaining support from parts of the military, civil authorities. This era saw clear conservative and liberal movements emerge and organize,
Leading to full-blown civil war.
Yeah. The sources describe confusion, distrust within the ranks, suspicion of institutions, a messy civil conflict, with conspiracies, intense religious and political clashes, like conservatives allying with bishops to form a pope's party.
Wow. This whole century of turbulence, internal conflict, economic woes, territorial loss, foreign pressure was the backdrop that made the eventual Mexican Revolution almost, well, inevitable, wouldn't you say?
It certainly set the stage. Our sources identified the Mexican Revolution, roughly 1910 to 1920, as one of the great revolutions globally, with effects deeply felt even today.
And it broke out, perhaps surprisingly, after a period of economic growth under Porfirio Diaz.
Right. The regime simply couldn't contain the population's simmering discontent any longer, despite the growth.
The revolution unleashed huge social, economic, political, and cultural changes, but also brought cycles of intense violence, often tied to the emergence of new power groups, new elites.
The sources note how early films often simplified the complex figures of the revolution into easy caricatures, heroes and villains.
Which rarely reflects reality.
No. The period after the fighting was crucial for nation building. The sources describe it as a time of many voices, previously marginalized groups, now trying to articulate what the nation should be.
Like the famous murals.
Exactly. Think of the murals of the era, explicitly trying to create new foundational myths and narratives for Mexico. A visual storytelling.
It sounds like a chaotic process, though, with different voices competing.
Very chaotic. Eventually, an official discourse emerged to try and bring some coherence to it all. The sources suggest the voices of the masses and the elite often seem to be reenacting roles, sometimes canceling each other out.
And remarkably, according to our sources, modern Mexico still seems to embody many of the core tensions and ideas forged during the revolution. Its legacy is that strong.
Yeah, it echoes.
So let's look at what drove it. After independence, as we said, some stability, economic improvement, even foreign investment. But beneath that,
the deep conflicts between conservatives wanting central control and liberals wanting federalism caused endless revolutions and government changes, back and forth.
Until Porfirio Diaz brought decades of stability, starting in 1876. But, as we discussed, it was authoritarian.
Right. Economic benefits heavily skewed towards a small elite and foreign investors, neglecting the poor majority. Organizing against Diaz began in the early 1900s.
Francisco Madero gained popular support, called for revolution, attacked key points. The Diaz regime finally fell in 1911.
But the story wasn't over. Madero became president, but he struggled to deliver on his promises, particularly about curbing abuses by banks and railroads. People grew disillusioned.
Workers, students revolted, and leaders like Emiliano Zapata launched revolutions against Madero in states like Morelos, the famous Zapatistas.
Right. Madero was eventually captured and executed in 1913, becoming a martyr figure.
Then Victoriano Huerta seized power, establishing a harsh dictatorship.
But public outcry forced him out in 1914. This even led to a brief U.S. occupation of Veracruz, another intervention.
The fighting just splintered further after that. After Zapata's death in 1919, various generals tried to take control, repressing the revolution in places, but failing to truly restore order across the country. Just more chaos.
Looking at key leaders, Benito Juarez stands out from the mid-19th century. As president, he pushed liberal reforms challenging the power of the church and upper classes.
Juarez is a pivotal figure, isn't he? Having resisted U.S. expansionism, faced down the French invasion and Maximilian.
He's credited with trying to modernize Mexico, establish republican institutions, expand education, dismantle privileges, a key reformer.
And Porfirio Diaz, initially a general under Juarez, later rebelled. After the French were ousted, Diaz took power and ruled for decades.
The sources describe his focus on granting concessions to capitalists, monopolies, building infrastructure like railways,
Connecting to the U.S.
but neglecting labor, importing cheap foreign workers. His long authoritarian rule, according to the sources, was ultimately disastrous for half a century, driving the dispossessed to organize unions and eventually revolt.
The consequences of the revolution were immense. It aimed to fundamentally reshape Mexican society. The rallying cry was Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty.
Right. The old rural power structures, the haciendas, were targeted for agrarian reform. Large estates were broken up, intended for distribution among poor peasants.
The 1917 Constitution codified agrarian reform as a right, and President Lázaro Cárdenas in the 1930s carried out the most significant land redistributions.
Post-revolutionary governments really emphasized this land distribution for social justice, incorporating peasants into communal lands called ejidos, aiming to give them a voice.
There were efforts at agricultural modernization, too.
Yeah, turning arid lands productive. Mexico shifted from importing food to becoming a producer and exporter for a time. The agrarian euphoria years, 1940s to late 60s.
But while many large estates became ejidos, the sources note that some large, non-expropriated estates kept their autonomy and continued to dominate the peasantry. So it wasn't a complete overhaul everywhere.
No. And industrial production grew too, drawing labor to factories and mines, nationalized enterprises.
But despite the ideals, the sources point out that the promise of land and liberty was only partially fulfilled. Deep inequality in income, living conditions, education. It persisted.
The figures cited from the 1970s, for example, show the wealthiest 10% earning vastly more than the poorest half combined. A huge gap.
Still, the revolution unquestionably raised awareness, mobilized masses. Many fought hoping for a better future, but the full benefits were only partially realized.
And the sources note that mass uprisings have continued in various states, Chiapas, Guerrero, Oaxaca, right up into the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The struggle continues.
This leads us to the post-revolutionary era and a remarkable cultural flourishing. The legacy of the revolution was just a dominant force in the 1920s.
The new government that came to power in 1920 faced huge challenges, sure, but also embarked on intense efforts to rebuild institutions and craft a national identity.
Though the sources note that political intrigue and purges were common, and questioning the revolution itself wasn't always easy, a relentless march of events.
Yet the revolution profoundly influenced culture and intellectual life, sparking enormous creativity. While it broke with pre-revolutionary systems, sometimes leading to illiteracy.
It also embraced new ideas.
Yeah. Though dissidence was suppressed, the era had this unique cultural energy, even incorporating popular forms like cowboy culture and vaudeville, described as a kind of universal language at the time.
A major achievement, though, was the Constitution of 1917. Mexico has a long history of constitutions, but this one's particularly significant, born directly from the 1910 social revolution.
Right. The 1857 Constitution was important, but had been undermined by corruption under Diaz. The 1917 Constitution aimed to secure sovereignty, define the branches of government,
And affirm fundamental rights, political, educational, religious freedom, tolerance, rule of law.
Coming in the context of WWI and capitalist imperialism, it included measures aimed at asserting social justice and the justness of man as core to the social contract. Pretty powerful ideas.
A century later, the sources reflect that Mexico has more citizens with more recognized rights, a vibrant, multicultural constitutional reality.
But they also suggest that the language and application of the Constitution can sometimes seem to invert the original principles, highlighting an ongoing struggle for its full realization. It's a living document, still being contested.
One of the most celebrated aspects of this era, though, is the Cultural Renaissance, really kicking off around 1921 under President Obregón and his education minister, José Vasconcelos.
Yeah, marked by the unveiling of Diego Rivera's murals in the National Palace and a conscious effort to invite artists, intellectuals, scientists who had left during the Diaz years back to contribute.
The cultural mission.
Exactly, a commitment to the revolution's cultural mission that lasted well into WWII.
The sources describe sensational advances across the arts, painting, sculpture, graphics, architecture, literature, and especially the murals. A golden age, unparalleled in Latin America at the time.
Yeah.
Comparable to Paris or Moscow.
The muralists, Rivera, Orozco, Siqueiros, became internationally famous, sparking artistic movements worldwide. They used these massive canvases to tell Mexico's story.
Indigenous history, the revolution, social themes.
Yeah. Think of Rivera's dramatic industrial scenes in Detroit, Orozco's powerful allegories like Prometheus or his MoMA mural.
depicting indigenous figures alongside symbols of modernity and conquest. Very complex.
And traditional arts were incorporated, blending pre-Hispanic designs with modern styles, modernismo.
Music, too.
Music also found a strong national voice, weaving classic melodies into folk forms, incorporating regional instruments, blending indigenous and European traditions in popular forms like corridos, dance styles, a real fusion.
Which brings us finally to Mexico in the modern era, grappling with a complex mix of contemporary issues and challenges.
And the sources suggest many of these have deep roots stretching all the way back to the struggles of independence in 1821.
Corruption, for instance, is highlighted as having troublesome historical roots and is seen by some as pervasive, even insurmountable, leading to frustration.
Yet, this is juxtaposed in the sources with Mexico's incredible history of perseverance struggling against colossal monsters, repeatedly rebuilding.
Right, they list achievements. Contributions to color TV, building a rich society, food beverage industries, the first oral contraceptive, tech foundations.
The country has faced devastation and rebuilt itself many times over. But the sources also express surprise at how opportunities are sometimes missed to act decisively at critical moments.
Yeah, they note problems like social services, criminal organizations, self-serving politics are often neglected until they reach crisis levels. Reactive rather than proactive.
There's a call in the material for a very long-term vision. For Mexico, ambitious goals, deep ideas. But this seems to face obstacles, a lack of consistent action.
And critics in the sources point to enormous ongoing issues. Significant immigration, what they call draconian drug wars, kidnapping cartels, corruption levels compared to some of the most challenging places globally. Pretty stark language.
On the issue of drug violence, a major contemporary challenge, the sources offer a, well, maybe surprising perspective.
How so?
They note that U.S. efforts to combat cartels in Latin America since the 1970s, costing maybe $1 trillion, have had limited impact and instead seem to have fueled more violence by fragmenting organizations.
Interesting. And the sources claim Mexico actually trafficked drugs, primarily to the U.S., for about a century, without the kind of major violence we see today.
Yeah, that's the argument presented. Why the change? The sources attribute this previous peaceful coexistence, if you can call it that, between cartels and authorities to the long reign of the PRI party.
The 70-year rule.
Exactly. The PRI's centralized control apparently allowed cartels to establish agreements and protection from state actors at various levels, essentially managing the violence, keeping it contained.
So the sources argue that the PRI's defeat in the 2000 and 2006 presidential elections disrupted this long-standing system.
Right. The lack of that centralized political coordination made it harder for cartels, forcing them to arm themselves more heavily to defend territory. This is seen as a primary reason for the dramatic surge in clustered killings that followed, a breakdown of the old rules.
Wow. Migration is another huge factor in modern Mexico. It's a major crossroads, and by the late 1990s, 1 in 10 Mexicans lived abroad. One of the largest immigrant communities globally.
And migration is seen by the sources as a direct result of those deep historical, political, socioeconomic forces, the contrast between North and South America, intolerance, identity issues, pushing millions across borders.
The process itself involves complex issues of destinations, transit policies, network building, and the human experience of, as one source puts it, representation of weights.
Historically, Mexico also saw a significant immigration in the 19th century, Chinese European migrants, sometimes with contradictory official policies. Huge influx from the U.S. and Spanish-speaking areas, too.
A point the sources highlight is that historical accounts of migration often miss the crucial details of the daily lives and dangers faced by the people undergoing these journeys.
A serious gap in understanding, they argue.
Environmental concerns are also critical, with criticism directed at the state oil company, Pemex. The sources point to gas flaring, burning off methane, as a highly visible symptom of larger problems.
Environmentalists, according to the sources, calculate the massive environmental impact CO2 emissions and point out the lost potential to generate significant electricity from that wasted gas.
Enough for 15% of the Yucatan's demand, one figure suggested.
While the sources mention some Pemex efforts towards energy saving and reducing certain types of contamination,
the environmentalist view presented suggests these efforts are small compared to the overall damage to air, soil, water. Pemex isn't seen as a paragon of efficiency or environmental compliance.
Not exactly, no.
On the economic front, Mexico experienced significant growth for decades, starting in the mid-1950s, accelerating through the 1960s with impressive GDP growth rates.
However, the sources are careful to note that during this growth period, little attention was paid to the large numbers of Mexicans who were effectively left out of this economic success. The benefits weren't shared widely.
And economic problems emerged in the 1980s, with sources tracing issues back to decisions made in late 1982, like nationalizing banks, pushing import substitution.
Seen as tied to an older, less sustainable economic model susceptible to decay.
There were pressures on the peso, its value falling, and a determination to prevent further depreciation, even though the sources mention evidence of economic prosperity in certain sectors right before these policy shifts. Complex picture.
Very. And political changes in recent decades, often linked to economic policy shifts, have seen power decentralized somewhat to local factions, provincial elites becoming more active.
Local politicians, the sources suggest, have learned to check executive power when it's adversarial or bolster it when it's allied, depersonalizing party conflict in a way.
A pendulum swinging towards focusing on local affairs after periods of intense centralism, and a gradual shift towards formal political competition replacing the militarized politics of the past, a different dynamic than older status-based politics.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we've traveled from the incredible ingenuity and complexity of ancient civilizations like the Olmec and Maya through the rise of the Mexica.
We saw the profound shock of the Spanish Conquest and the centuries of colonial rule that followed, creating that deep, complex blend of cultures while also imposing rigid structures and inequalities.
We trace the long, often violent path to independence, the tumultuous 19th century marked by internal conflict, external pressures, territorial loss, all building towards the seismic shifts of the Mexican Revolution.
And finally, we looked at how the legacies of all these periods manifest in modern Mexico, with its ongoing challenges, drug violence, corruption, migration, environment alongside its incredible potential and history of resilience.
It's clear from these sources that understanding Mexico's present reality is impossible without looking deeply into its past. History isn't just something that happened, it actively shapes the present.
Yeah, you really feel that connection.
The sources capture this fascinating tension. Mexico's deep history of perseverance, of struggling against enormous odds, its vast potential in culture, biodiversity, past achievements, contrasted with persistent, ingrained challenges.
One source noted the difficulty of writing history, of capturing the mysteries and the constant struggle towards reality. Looking at Mexico's past, you certainly get a sense of that complex, evolving reality. It's not simple.
Absolutely. So, here's a thought to leave with, building on what we've discussed. Considering Mexico's long history of overcoming immense challenges from empires falling to civil wars and interventions, the sources mention this need for a very clear long-term vision and focused action. How might that kind of approach, really leveraging that deep historical capacity for resilience and cultural fusion, help bridge the gap between Mexico's immense potential and the ingrained issues like drug violence and corruption it faces today? What lessons are embedded in that history of constantly rebuilding? Something worth thinking about.